El invitado de hoy nos acompaña desde Europa. Bartha es director de EPICENTER, un centro de información de políticas europeas, formado por varios think tanks que colaboran entre sí. Fue fellow en el Departamento de Publicaciones del Independent Intitute en California y es licenciado con honores en Política y Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad Sheffield y máster en Teoría Política de la London School of Economics. El día de hoy estaremos hablando sobre economía en Europa, el poder político de los gobiernos, la educación y el rol de los intelectuales y think tanks en la formación del futuro y los futuros líderes. Welcome to Palabra Pública. It's a great pleasure to having you with us today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. I'd like to start our conversation by talking a little bit about the economy. Europe's response to the pandemic has taken different shapes from country to country, depending on the infection rates. We have seen the same here. There are no two countries in a row with identical measurement or level of response to each wave of infection. However, countries like Chile tend to take a close look at some European policies, cultures, and societies. We don't want to discuss the crash Chile has with fostering European initiatives, but it is quite straightforward to see those impacts. Germany, Spain, and United Kingdom, Switzerland, and so forth are important models when we talk about public policies. So let me give you an overall idea about what's going on here. In October 2020, the BBC wrote an article where developed the question, why Latin America is the region with more death in the world? Of course, thinking on COVID. It continues, Latin America had the time to be prepared and face the pandemic in a good shape. However, its structural economic condition, housing, and health system lead to the continent to become in a place that favor infection. On the other hand, statistically speaking, the United Kingdom and Chile, I'm from Chile, are not too different from each other. For instance, United Kingdom has 0.06% of the population infected with 0.001% of death, while Chile has 0.04% of the population infected with 0.001% of death, quite similar. So whether they are large or small numbers, great intervention has been done into the economy. For instance, the tourism sector in Chile was heavily damaged, and ironically, today the government offers around $60 million to the sector as investment, an absurd amount if we consider that in 2018, we received around $3,700 million by income of foreign exchange in tourism. So my question is simple. What is the current state of the economy in Europe?
Well, if there is a simple question, there is a simple answer. I don't think we're in a good state of affairs at all. I think we are very far from it, and it's going to be a very, very challenging year for most European economies in 2021. You mentioned that a lot of Latin American countries are looking at Europe when it comes to mitigating COVID and public health policies and how to respond with economic measures. I think when the whole pandemic started, interestingly enough, Europe was looking at China. And when it came to the public health policies, Europe, at least most European countries, decided that they're going to implement the same public health policy as China did, namely very stringent lockdowns. Whilst this is, I think, understandable from a public health perspective, obviously it has tremendous economic impact. So the countries that were hit the hardest and that implemented the strictest lockdowns have the biggest recession in Europe. So if you look at France, if you look at Italy, if you look at the United Kingdom, almost all of them have a double-digit recession in 2020. So almost 10% of the economy basically disappeared within a year, which is an unbelievably high number. If you take a look at the financial crisis, you don't have similar numbers in most European countries. And it was through a longer period of time, not in such a short amount of time. So I think the economic recession is felt all over Europe. A lot of the countries are trying to save employment by furloughing their workforce, which in return then increases public debt immensely. So you mentioned the IE, and I'm normally based in London, and the government in London implemented a furlough scheme that cost 50 billion British pounds to the taxpayers in 2020. I think it was the right call. I think it's better to increase public debt in the short term and try to save some of the jobs. These jobs would have disappeared, or many of them would have disappeared, because the government decided to lock down. So I think this is rather a compensation for a lot of people instead of just arbitrary welfare handouts. But 50 billion pounds is a lot of money, and 10 million people in the UK on furlough is a lot of people on furlough. So we will have to see how to get out of this. And the good news is that there is a vaccine. There is, light at the end of the tunnel. So it's certainly possible to get out, but how quickly the vaccine rollout is happening, how quickly these lockdown restrictions are lifted, is going to have a tremendous impact on the economic forecast in 2021. And I'm worried that a lot of the governments are going to be too cautious, learning from the experience of the second wave and with the experience of the first wave. I think they're going to be very, very hesitant to lift a lot of these restrictions on the economy. And if we go on well into Q2, Q3 of 2021, and several restrictions are going to still be in place, then I think the high hopes about the quick economic return are going to disappear. So I have a lot of faith in vaccines. I have a lot of faith in basically medical innovation, trying to get out of this miserable situation. But I'm honestly not sure how long European economies can keep on financing themselves without actually the productive companies and the productive workforce doing the heavy lifting and the main job of actually creating wealth that governments can in return spend afterwards.
Mm-hmm. So Ignacio?
Well, yeah, first and foremost, thank you very much, Adam, for being with us. We appreciate your presence for sure. It's awesome. Well, throughout 2020, as Francisco just commented before, we have seen the rise and expansion of governments and restrictions of individual freedoms everywhere, unfortunately. Chile, Argentina, South America in general have applied extreme quarantines to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. Strategies that lately, and following even the WHO standards, have been proven to fail as measures to reach its ends, right? So, as the economist from Argentina, Javier Milei, wrote, I quote, "In many cases, we have harmed the rule of law and democracies because of a virus that took 105 days to be responsible of killing the amount of people that die due to natural causes, even every single day of the year." Quote, "Of course, this is a sensitive matter for individuals involved in losing a beloved one, right? But after mentioning Javier, many statistical studies about the results of prolonged quarantines in Argentina, he concludes that 95.5% of the GDP's growth, it's been explained by the effects on not letting people even go out on the streets, and not even necessary to say to allow individuals to work freely. This is not even mentioning health issues in general causes by its measures on the population. So, taking the case into Europe, Spain, as far as I know, also applied one of the longest quarantines in the region. From March to June of the last year, checking on the data, it says that the drop of the Spanish GDP for the second quarter of 2020 was 21.6%, which also compares to Argentina in terms of the effects. And also other countries that have taken somewhat similar strategies, even Canada also. So, in my opinion, and I would like to know yours, we have seen acceptance from society in terms of allowing government officials to reduce individual rights, as, for example, the right to be free to work, or to gather together with friends, even going out on a walk and breathe some fresh air. This collective fear has also given the perfect excuse for the expansion of governments to take care of the people, in some sense, which relates somewhat to Orwell's 1984. My question, to be concise, is, what is your opinion regarding to the expansion of government and its role in terms of its role within society post-COVID?
It's not an easy question, and I don't think there is an easy answer. I think from a classical liberal perspective, it's understandable that during emergencies, there are some public government interventions. My freedom only lasts as long as I'm not limiting yours. And obviously, with a pretty deadly virus going around, my actions do have an impact on my fellow citizens. So I think temporary emergency measures, both from a public health perspective and from kind of a societal general well-being perspective, I sympathize with the utilitarian argument that they're worth it. Obviously, it's a trade-off. You're losing a lot of your freedoms, hopefully just for a temporary weeks and months and not years. But I'm not one of those libertarians who say that there is zero reason for public intervention whatsoever when we are talking about the pandemic. I think, especially in the initial phase, I understand why some of these mitigating measures have been implemented. The bigger question is how you influence society through introducing these measures in the long term. And there I'm a lot more pessimistic. There I'm worried that, as you have mentioned, fear is an incredibly powerful factor for human beings. As the vaccines are being rolled out, as the virus will hopefully recede and is already receding globally, we need to argue that every single restriction that has been implemented in the last year will be and should be lifted. I think that will be the big battle of classical liberals and libertarians. A lot of classical liberals were divided in the past year. I know I have a lot of American friends who said that lockdowns are completely unjustified. It's not the role of government to protect the health and well-being. Those who are vulnerable and are fearful of the virus, they should be shielding, and the rest should be going about their lives. I think there are good practical utilitarian arguments why that would have been impossible. And I tend to believe them and count myself to the second camp, that I'm okay with temporary restrictions. But for example, the fact that governments want to control borders even more strictly in the future than they have in the past, I think those feelings should be, or those policies should completely disappear. I give you an example. In the UK at the moment, there is a lot of discussion about quarantine hotels and forcing people. Basically, it's illegal to leave the country at the moment. You cannot leave the country unless you comply with some emergency measures on health. So if you have a operation in a Swiss hospital, you can leave the country. If your work demands you to leave the country for essential legal reasons, then you can leave the country, but it's illegal to have a holiday in Spain, or it's illegal to just visit family. So it's a pretty scary thought that you're not legally allowed to leave the country. But what's even more scary is the discussion that's currently going around controlling these borders indefinitely, basically. So the argument is that because the pandemic and the virus mutates, as long as the whole globe is not vaccinated, we should be shutting down the UK borders, and we can open up the economy domestically. We can do whatever we like in the country, but we cannot leave the UK, and we cannot return without quarantine hotels if we still somehow manage to get out of the country. And a pandemic traditionally, historically, lasts at least 3 to 4 years. We have a vaccine, that's great. It might be somewhat shorter, but shutting down borders for years and years, just for the off chance of a mutated virus or maybe even getting some sick people into the country from a holiday, I think that's an incredibly scary thought. I'm much more worried about the long-term impact of COVID and how people are going to be thinking and feeling when it comes to government interventions than the short-term measures. I think the short-term measures, they're debatable where the trade-offs are, but there I do understand why some of them have been implemented. But if governments are planning to keep a lot of these restricting measures of social distancing, of shutdown borders, of total public transparency when it comes to your public health data, having COVID tests at every single restaurant and movie theater for years and years, I don't think that those measures are justifiable. And I hope that in Europe, we're going to be able to return to normality as soon as 60-70% of the people are vaccinated, which should be this summer.
Yeah, what you just mentioned about the quarantine hotels, as far as I know, that's a measure that the Canadian government is actually undertaking at the moment. And it's, as far as I know, it's going to be applied the February 20th. What's the date today? Yeah, well, in a few days, it's going to...
Couple of days.
Yeah, that's going to start to be a thing. But, well, Adam, moving to my last question. So about that topic, we have seen lately cultural tensions between one another in Europe, right? Especially the West with the Middle East, so to say. Issues that have arisen in countries like France and Germany in regards to immigration that have been well known worldwide, which of course tend to be used as political capital rather than to be studied as to what or why are the fundamental reasons of why these things happen, unfortunately. Also, many other topics that become overwhelming if we don't happen to speak about each one of them separately. Topics like social behavior, global warming, economic policies, and so forth. Most of the times, officials follow, as Alexis de Tocqueville would suggest to be this generating principle of democracy as it is public opinion. So in this sense, what is your opinion about the future of Europe and how, if so, COVID changed people's attitudes and behaviors in regards to individual freedom, free market capitalism, personal responsibility, and the role of the state?
I'm a long-term optimist, but a short-term pessimist. So I think in the next couple of years, a lot of classical liberals are going to have a big battle ahead, basically fighting to return to some of the core four freedoms that we have enjoyed in Europe. I'm a classical liberal who is very much a pro-EU classical liberal. I think the EU has enabled the core four freedoms in the last 4 decades. The freedom of movement of people, goods, services, and capital is one of the greatest European achievements, which is a libertarian dream if you expand it globally. But I think the EU got lost in its ways in the last couple of years. There have been a lot of voices that would like to build an EU that's very much closed to the outside world. I think there are increased voices for protectionism and inward-lookingness, and I'm quite conscious that a lot of these feelings have been only sped up through the pandemic. At the very beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion about export controls, and this discussion resurfaced with the vaccine procurement issue as well. So if you remember, in March and April, a lot of the governments across the globe scrambled to get the necessary PPE equipment for their doctors and the general population. And a lot of them included or decided that they're going to implement export bans. So when the situation got bad in France, France banned the export of masks even to Italy and Germany, and the other way around as well. Which was an incredibly scary move for a lot of liberals here in Europe, simply because it goes against the basic principles of the single market. It's like saying that a company based in New York State is unable to export goods to Washington State. It's just unbelievable for a lot of Europeans to have completely shut borders, even if that was a temporary measure. They realized that this is a massive problem and it needs fixing. So in a couple of weeks, the European Commission did get involved. And basically they said, okay, there will not be any kind of export restrictions and export controls within the single market, which should have been a given in the first place. But the conversation moved to export controls and protectionism against non-EU countries. And I'm equally worried about that. The single market is great. Free movement of goods between the 27 EU countries is great, but there's a whole big word out there. We should be trading with every single country on the planet. We should be resisting non-tariff trade barriers and tariff trade barriers, and definitely not think about controlling what European companies can export to other countries in the globe. So I'm a lot more worried about those voices that basically want to keep a rather open Europe amongst the 28 or 27 EU member states, but a very closed and very kind of distant attitude to the rest of the world. I think the main goal of classical liberals should be to advocate for further classical liberal reforms here in Europe. So deepening the single market in the digital area, making sure that there is actually, no geo-blocking and availability of all services within Europe, irrespective of how small or large a country is. So we can work on the single market a lot, but we should be opening up to the rest of the world as fast and as much as possible. I think we should be negotiating free trade agreements with Latin American countries. The Mercosur agreement has been a good first step, but a lot of the countries or national governments are still unwilling to ratify that because basically excuses about environmentalism, about human rights and the like. But it's the role of classical liberals to advocate for a global and interconnected economy. And we should be telling the success stories. I think the fact that global supply chains during the worst economic crisis and during a global pandemic, the supply chains have held up, and that there were no food shortages within Europe. There were no major issues when it came to manufacturing. There were some short-term issues around PPE equipment. That's true, but that was rather production bottleneck and not an issue of supply chains and trade. So globalization essentially works, even in the most difficult scenarios. So I think there is a success story for us to tell and make sure that people are realizing that and aren't going to support a very inward-looking, very protectionist attitude that seems to be more and more prevalent in a lot of European capitals.
Mm-hmm. Right. I totally agree with your last statement. Thank you very much, Adam. Back to you, Francisco.
Okay. Before to pass to the last question, I'd like to ask you about, I want to go one question back, just maybe very short. What would be for you the red flag because you said you're optimistic that in short term, the government intervention is okay, it's understandable.
Not optimistic, but I understand. Yeah.
So what would be the red flag when it's too much? What is the point when, okay, the government passed the line?
It's always difficult because the governments will keep on pushing and pushing the red line as much as they can. For me personally, I think when politicians are starting to rule by decree instead of votes in parliaments, that's an incredibly worrying sign. It has been pretty prevalent across Europe, mostly in Eastern member states, but also in France, also in more developed liberal democratic societies, that essentially presidents and prime ministers are ruling by decree for months and then maybe for years. I think that's an incredibly worrying precedent. As imperfect as parliaments are and as imperfect as our democratic institutions can be when it comes to outcomes, it's still, in most European countries, a good oversight over the executive power. when my home country, Hungary, introduced a rule by decree in March and gave the prime minister almost unlimited powers to do whatever they like. The prime minister implemented a lot of policies that had nothing to do with public health. They changed the constitution and handed out a lot of money to basically private foundations of their friends, corruption 101. They cemented their powers even further before the election next year, and implemented so many policies that had nothing to do with public health or the pandemic whatsoever. It was a perfect excuse for them because, once they have the power, why not use it? I guess that's the attitude of most politicians. And there weren't any kind of checks on them because people were afraid. They had bigger things to worry about than a constitutional change that hands out a lot of taxpayers' money to private foundations. And the government managed to get away with it. And no one is really actually talking about these issues anymore because it happened half a year ago. People were concentrating on their loved ones and their health. People were concentrating on the jobs that they have lost and not constitutional matters. So the lack of parliamentary oversight and governance is an incredibly worrying issue. And then there are, of course, a lot of petty regulatory annoying things, like in France and even the UK. You weren't allowed to spend time outside in fresh air. Like the government came to you and limited how much you can be in a park just because they could. From a public health perspective, obviously it doesn't mitigate the virus. We know that it's an airborne virus. It can spread indoors quite easily. But if you're outside walking in a park, you're 99% not impacting anyone. But bureaucrats can overwork themselves and overthink the situation and just implement very petty policies that have a negative impact on the quality of your life, but they don't have a positive impact from public health perspective. So that's definitely a trade-off that's not worth making. But in general, my answer to your question is basically if there is a lack of parliamentary oversight and a lack of checks and balances within a political system, then classical liberals should be screaming and fighting against those processes as loudly as possible.
Fantastic. Okay, Rafael, it's your turn.
Yes, well, first, Adam, thank you very much for being here with us. And before I ask my question, I will want to say thank you. I don't know if you remember me, but I contacted you maybe 1 year ago, doing all this process, asking the permit of your institute for reproducing, in my next book, editorial project, the chapter of Dr. Nima Sanandaji from his books Scandinavian on Exceptionalism. And Adam was the person who helped me with all the process of the permit. Thank you very much.
Sure, very welcome.
Thank you. By the way, my book is almost done. The COVID also delayed everything. The authors and all the other stuff was very, 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 very well emphasized with this problem. Well, my question is about this kind of job, your job, my job, the job of Francisco and Ignacio said. It's about for EPICENTER, what is the role of intellectuals? The intellectual think tanks, very important, the think tanks, the philosophy and the empiricism. Also the empiricism because, for example, I have been professor for many years in Venezuela, and the empiricism in the academia is very important, okay? You cannot be a professor in the university if you don't apply empirical data, empirical methods, okay? But what is the role for the EPICENTER in the post-pandemic world, okay? In the post-pandemic world, and how to convince the average people about the virtues of free market capitalism? Because sometimes people say, okay, who are the promoters, the advocacies of the free market capitalism? A bunch of professors, very well, in a good condition, with good incomes, but in my case, when I was in Venezuela, I was very far to be a wealthy professor, okay? But then the people say, okay, but the free market capitalism helped you to go to the United States and have a good place, a good job place. Then that is the kind, I don't agree with that kind of thoughts. But that is the kind of thought that in countries like Venezuela, you have to debate. Okay, you like the free market capitalism because you are good, because you are a wealthy people. Then what is the role for intellectual think tanks after the pandemic?
Our role is really to explain that free markets are all about opportunity. We don't like corruption, whether it's government corruption, whether it's corporate corruption. We are about opportunities for people. And basically, free markets and market principles help the least disadvantaged people to actually get where the billionaires are today. And I think there are many, many success stories from all across the globe. So I agree with you, Rafael, completely, that there is a big perception issue, especially in the Americas. Both North and South America has a pretty big perception issue around libertarianism and classical liberalism, because they kind of associate it with corporatism, which I think it couldn't be further from the truth, right? I think a lot of the classical liberal principles around free markets and competition are often against big companies. I think big companies, especially in the US and Europe, are the great benefactors of regulation. A lot of the regulatory frameworks that we see implemented in the EU, big companies don't have a problem paying some extra taxes when it comes to digital taxes. They don't really have a big problem with the very harsh GDPR privacy laws that the EU implemented. They have deep pockets, they can cope. But it stops the next guy from becoming the next Google, from becoming the next Facebook, or innovating their way out and fighting their way up. And it's not only true for startups, but it's true for individuals as well. I think a lot of the educational policies that we're discussing here in Europe around educational vouchers and the opportunities for youngsters to get ahead. I want to live in a society where even if you're from a pretty disadvantaged family background, you can go to a great school, you can study a lot, you can found your own company afterwards, or go and work for a multinational and earn some proper money. And I think it's a lot easier to achieve that with classical liberal policies and principles in place than with socialist principles. So I was born in Hungary, in Budapest, just 3 years after the collapse of communism. So I haven't experienced communism myself. I'm count myself pretty lucky in that regard. But still, a lot of these societal traditions and customs in the 90s and early 2000s, they relate very strongly to the 45 years of communist period that Hungary had. And Hungary actually was the same country, or formed one country with Austria and several neighboring countries before the First World War. And it was very interesting to see that those ones that ended up on the free side of Europe, west from the Elbe and west from the Iron Curtain, how their economies grew, how their society improved, what kind of health and well-being people enjoyed, and how the situation was on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So, I mean, Germany is the perfect example. Again, same country. One was east, one was west, and completely different societal and economic outcomes just in 45 years. There's no better empirical proof that socialism failed. It's failed in Europe, it failed in Asia, it failed in Latin America, but somehow public intellectuals are still rethinking other ways to express the same kind of socialist ideas and hope for some better outcomes. The better outcomes are not going to come. So I think it's important that we trust the empirical evidence and say, okay, these socialistic policies have failed several times in the past. They're not going to work in the future, but we can't be on the defense all the time. I think we have a very, very positive story to tell. Just if I consider my own region, Eastern Europe, how much it changed, how much it developed in the last 30 years. The Baltics especially, they were part of the Soviet Union, one of the poorest parts of Europe. And just in 30 years, they have completely changed their policies, completely changed their economic attitude. And it's one of the most free market oriented, one of the most digitalized, and one of the fastest growing places in the whole of Europe in the last 30 years. An immense success story. And I think we should be regularly pointing to these several success stories, whether Francisco is in Chile, whether you're in Venezuela, whether I am in Europe. We can point out a lot of success stories that have happened through classical liberal reforms in the last 20 to 30 years. And you have asked about the role of think tanks. I think that's kind of the role of think tanks, to provide the intellectual ammunition to political parties, to academia, to campaigners, and just provide them with the ideas and provide them with all the tools that they can use in kind of the policy battles and political battles on the side of free markets and classical liberalism. So EPICENTER is doing exactly that. We have 9 member think tanks from all across Europe. Basically, they're working on domestic regulatory reform for most of the times. But of course, these countries are heavily impacted by regulations and policies in Brussels. So we set up the network in 2014, initially with 6 member think tanks, saying that whatever is pan-European and whatever relates to Brussels, we're going to do it under the EPICENTER network umbrella, instead of the individual member think tanks trying to introduce their research pieces themselves to Brussels policymakers. And it has been a fantastic project, because at the beginning, it was very much like an informal kind of network of exchanging best practice ideas and talking about upcoming projects. Whereas now, everyone is writing shared research pieces. We're doing shared communications. Sometimes we are even doing shared fundraising proposals. So it's very much a collaborative pan-European network of researchers, communication experts, working together basically to further the goal of classical liberalism, not just domestically in European countries, but also on the pan-European level.
Great, Adam. Well, remember, if in some moment EPICENTER wants to increase the richness and get out of Europe soon, remember Econintech. Remember the name of Econintech. But by the way, our president, the president of Econintech, is a Spanish. She's a professor in the University of Miami, and she's Spanish. And actually, we at this moment we are in the process of review of an article that we wrote about the European Union oil dependency and how's that a threat to economic growth and diplomatic freedom. I will send you when it is published.
Well, the good news is that although EPICENTER's output is very much EU focused, but a lot of the focus of the EU relates to the rest of the world. So we are always searching for global partners, whether in Latin America, whether in Asia, whether in the United States, who can basically work with us on trade-related issues, on immigration-related issues. Maybe there are some even regulatory affairs and best practices that we can copy. So definitely very, very happy to think about collaborative projects that we can work with.
I'll be in contact with you.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And I want to thank you again for staying with us and invite you. You want to come a second time further? You're always welcome. Now's your household. Palabra Pública.
Thank you so much for hosting me. It has been a pleasure, and I promise very happy to return to a further section in the future.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.